Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Sloan the Record. That's what we're calling it now. A family podcast with Ron Sloan and myself, Nathan Sloan. Each week, we're going on the record about family history, past and present. Along the way, we'll see if we can't learn more about the people, traditions, values, and stories that made us, and open a window for everyone else to see a little slice of rural life in North Carolina. New episodes are published every Sunday, so we welcome you to join us on the journey as we see what we might uncover together. You can make sure that you don't miss an episode by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or the podcast service of your choice. Dad, say hello.
Hello.
Today, well, before we get into the topic for the day, I do want to just catch up. We have a little catch up on what's been going on since last week. And this is a pretty big one because Christmas is what happened between last week and this week. So I'll go first by sharing just one nice memory or thing from Christmas that you enjoyed. And of course, goes without saying, seeing family, always nice. So I'll do probably memorable gift. That'll be something for me. Last week, I talked about how my entertainment recommendation or thing I had going on was the Indiana Jones and the Great Circle video game. And that game has been a lot of fun to play, but they have a special edition of it, a collector's edition that comes with this big globe and replica artifacts from the video game and a little journal, like the one that was in Last Crusade. That's a blank journal you can write your adventures in. It just was a really thoughtful, well put together collector's edition, and of course it comes with a copy of the game too, so that you can keep that and play it. And Emily got that for me for Christmas, and I thought it would be neat, but then when I opened it, as I went through each little thing in it, I was like, wow, they really put a lot of thought into this. It's one of the nicer collector edition video games if you're into that sort of thing. It's one of the nicer put together sets, so I don't know exactly how much it cost, probably expensive, but it was very nice, and I very much appreciate Emily getting that for me. So if you're listening, Emily, thank you. I really did like it. How about you, Dad?
Well, that's a pretty easy one for me, and you were responsible. That
I did not set this up to try and get you to say anything.
I know that, but it's just a fact. I think you mentioned in the last podcast something about the 84 Supra that I had, that you found the license, my license from a couple of months before you were born, that had expired, and I put in the console. And we are attempting to bring that old Supra back to life. And Nathan handed me this box, and I opened it up, and it had a couple of initials and collectibles. I forget what they were, like VS or something, collectibles. And I first thought, well, maybe is it a car? Is it something from Star Wars? A limited edition thing, because I knew he'd be aware of everything there. And then I was going, well, I never have found a model of a 63 Corvette convertible, so I wonder if he found one of those. But opened the thing up, and lo and behold, it's a perfect replica of my 1984 Supra. Same color, every detail is there. You can even read the badges on the hood and on the pillar by the driver's door. I'll have to have it ready and show it the next one we do. But it's beautiful, and I've really enjoyed looking at that. And it's kind of inspiring too. It's got me kind of fired up about the project, which had cooled down a bit.
Yeah, the 1/18th scale hopefully will get us both interested in getting there with the 1/1 scale. But it was neat to see it. It's one of those things that I think we had seen it at one point in the past. They did a run of them in 2017. These are, resin models. They're not die cast, so the doors don't open or anything like that, but they hand paint them, and they are extremely detailed. Not perfect, but pretty close to, as close as we're going to get to being exactly like his car. So right now we have the engine hopefully finished and working, and it's sitting on an engine stand, and we just need to finish cleaning out the inside of that engine bay and weld some stuff in there that's rusted away, and hopefully we can get a new exhaust system and put the engine in and hear the old 5M GE crank up for the first time in 38 years. He's doing a little show and tell. If you can see the video at any point in the future. I know most of you are probably listening on an audio podcast, but we do have some video rolling, so maybe we'll make that available somehow. But that's been a long project already, and of course, anybody that's restored cars knows that it can be years sometimes before you get them done. But
that's how we found it.
Hopefully, we don't have years plural left before getting it done. We'd like to get it done and have something there to enjoy.
And
all right, well,
here's a
we're sorry. I'll try to mute if I have to cough. By the way, last week he sounded like he had a froggy, croaky thing going on, and this week you can probably hear that with me. So I guess I caught whatever he had there at the office, and yeah, so that's something that we're going to have to work through. Apologize in advance for having the croaky sounding voice.
That's the model.
Yep.
If you're watching.
That is the model. So, topic for today, and you talked a little bit about Granddaddy Sloan at the last episode, and his, birth date and some of his childhood stuff, but wanted to get a little bit more detail onto Eldon Sloan Sr. I believe that is his full name.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, this is just your recollection of him. If you were to ask me to do a biography in 40 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever we have on you, I know that I would leave a lot of stuff out, and my memory would not be perfect, and that's right now. So, I don't expect you to get every detail right here kind of off the cuff, but the high points, I'm sure, are still right there, easily accessible to you. And I thought I'd start off by just sharing what my recollection is of my grandfather, which, unfortunately, he got sick about the time I was 8 years old. And so I don't have a whole lot of memories before age 4 anyway. So really, I had just a 3 or 4 year window there where I had memories. We'd go visit them on Sundays for lunch, and he'd be there at lunch, and he'd talk to me sometimes about basketball, and he would say encouraging little things to me whenever he did see me. I don't have any kind of negative emotion of him being like a loud, angry, grumpy kind of man. He seemed to be very gentle and kind, and took a genuine interest in all of his grandchildren, not just me. So, I appreciate that about him. But yeah, he did seem pretty quiet, and he would kind of have his lunch and then retreat back into take a nap somewhere. And that was fine with us kids, because us kids would go outside and play anyway. So, it's not like we were really missing out on a whole bunch of time, but that's sort of my recollection. So maybe there's something in this conversation that can help fill in a little bit more of the picture for me of who he was. So going back to the very beginning, you said that his birth date was what?
It was August the 25th of 1914.
August 25th, 1914. So just over 100 years from when we're recording this. And in broad strokes, what can you tell me about his childhood?
Well, he earliest things he's told me about was his mother contracted a I guess it's a sepsis in her jaw from a abscessed tooth when he was 3 years old, and they called it lockjaw then, and died when he was 3 years old. And, he told me he could still remember, this is probably 5 years before his death. He told me about remembering people coming to the home, and they had set her casket in the parlor on 2 sawhorses, and that people stayed up all night with the casket. And then he told me about going to the funeral, and the casket was black with glass panels in the sides, and it was drawn by a black horse, and his dad followed it on a Model T, and he rode with his dad and his brother on the Model T, and his older brother. And he said he could remember the Model T at the slowest gear and gas setting would catch up on the hearse, and he would have to take it out of gear. Kind of reminded me of trying to be in a parade route with a straight drive. But that's the earliest thing of his memory that he ever told me. But then he told me about his dad was a rural mail carrier, and because of that, and he was gone so long, he couldn't look after the children. And so relatives took the children, and they kind of rotated them around. And, one would go to Uncle Fleming's, one would go to Aunt Lizzie's, one would go to Uncle Duncan's. He had a sister that was about a year old. Dad was 3, and I think Calvert was 5 or 6. There were 3 kids in the family. And so he spent a lot of his life with relatives. And I think that's sort of where his focus on work and his work ethic kind of developed, because I think he had this fear of imposing on people, so he wanted to carry his weight and be of value from things he said and his behavior through his life. It seemed to set a pattern that he felt like he needed to be busy. He didn't need to waste time. Now, I don't know if that's from, relatives fussing at him to, do something, or if it was just, a fear he had of being thought of as a burden or whatever. But he always had really favorable feelings towards his family. He loved all those relatives, and I can remember as a small child going with him to visit them, and stories, that he told me about different ones. And Aunt Lizzie, his mother's sister, had several boys, Perry and James, and there was one more. Oh gosh, I can't think of him. He was a very successful businessman. But anyway, Dad grew up with them feeling sort of like they were brothers, and was extremely close, especially to James. And James's son David and I were born. We were born 3 days apart. He was born on the 6th, and I was born on the 10th. So 3 days, 4 days. There was 3 days between us, and we were always close and still are. We talk about every week. So that sort of snapshot of his side of the family and how it went. Calvert farmed. His older brother farmed. He married, didn't have any children. He married my Aunt Burnell, and we helped them put in tobacco and farm when I was young. Dad was on the mail route, so Uncle Calvert would come over and oversee putting in our tobacco. He'd sort of be the man in charge and tell everybody what to do and keep it going. And then in return, Eldon and I would go over when he was putting in tobacco and do whatever was needed.
Do you mean Eldon Jr.?
Eldon Jr., my brother.
Yeah. Well, tell me, did he ever mention a relative or not a relative, just a person that was a major influence on him growing up? Like maybe it was a mentor or just somebody that he looked up to or somebody that taught him something?
Yeah, apparently from my mother told me about this after Dad passed, that at some point when he was a young guy, I guess 12 or so, he went through kind of a rebellious period. And, that may have been the lack of parental figures in his life. I don't know why, but he was, they took him to a school in Robbins, I believe she told me, in Robbins. And he was enrolled in that school, and a gentleman there, the principal of the school, saw something in Dad and kind of took him under his wing. And Mother said that he was a major influence on him. And Robbins is not that far from the Charlotte area. And I remember Dad telling me that this man took him to Charlotte to hear this preacher. And the preacher had this large revival. And it was in a tent. And the preacher's name was George W. Truett. I think he was a predecessor to Billy Graham. And Dad had even told me about this and about what an impact that George W. Truett had on him. And Dad had books by him. I didn't ever read any of them. Melissa, my daughter, recently found one in an antique store, his biography, and brought it to me. And it was interesting to get that and to go through it and find out some things about him. I'm looking forward to reading the entire book. But I think the big thing to come out of that in terms of, I guess you'd say, the impact that this minister had on him, I don't know if that was the time when my dad was saved, when he accepted Christ, or if it was at another time. But I do know that this man was the man that took him, the principal, was a huge influence on my dad's Christian walk. So I don't know if my dad had already accepted Christ or if it was just the impact of the message when he went to see George W. Truett. But when I came along, my dad wanted to name me for him, or in honor of him, and so he named me. My mother chose the name Ronald, and my dad wanted to name me Truett in honor for him, so that's how I ended up with Ronald Truett. And then when I had a son, I named him Nathaniel Truett.
That's me.
But, my dad was a very strong Christian. He wasn't somebody that would get in your face, but he would, without him saying anything about it, you knew where he was and where he came
And I assume
from.
that's, usually when somebody says that in regards to faith, religion, that means that, their actions in some way would convey that about them more so than their words. Mm-hmm. So what is it about his demeanor, his actions, things he did or things he didn't do that you think, led people to believe he was a believer?
It was primarily how he treated people. He took time. Took time for people. I could feel like he was in the biggest rush in the world, but if somebody came by to talk to him, they would never feel that. And he did what he could to help people. I know people, would come to the house sometimes to talk to him about things, and and to ask. Dad was real private about things, especially if he did something to help somebody. We would rarely know it until somebody else said something about it, or that person did. And I keep having little interesting things. Several years after he passed, I was in a Golden Corral with my family, and when I went up to pay, they were one of the few restaurants that would let you pay with a check. And I handed my check over, and the lady said, "Sloan, you don't run across many of those." And she said, you're not by any chance related to an Eldon Sloan, are you? And I said, yes, that's my brother. And she said, no, this would be a much older man. And I said, oh, you're talking about my father? And she said, yes. And I said, yeah, that's my dad. And she said, oh, my goodness. She said, can you wait here a minute and let me go get my husband? And I said, sure. And she comes back with this man, and he's never met me before, but he acted like he was meeting an old friend, And he was just so excited that I was Eldon Sloan's son. And he started telling me about, his life. He grew up on my dad's mail route. And he said they were very poor. And he talked about how my dad, which this is one of the things I'm talking about, Dad was always pushed on that mail route because he had to get back and put up the mail for the next day and so forth, and needed to be through the route at a certain time. But this man is telling me that Dad would always take time. They would try to meet him at the mailbox because he said we didn't see many people then, and you didn't have telephone, and we didn't have a TV. And he said sometimes the mailman was the only contact we had, during the day with, outside world. And he said your dad would take time up with us, and we would bring him iced tea, and he would drink that iced tea like it was the best thing, which the funny thing to me was Dad never drank iced tea at home. He always drank water. He didn't drink tea, sweet tea. But he would drink it if they brought it to him. And he said sometimes, very rare times, they would have lemonade, and he loved lemonade. But the other interesting thing was he said their favorite thing was that he kept chewing gum in the glove compartment, and he would give them chewing gum and candy and things like that. But he said he always had chewing gum. And I was like, what? I said, he never had chewing gum for us. Chewing gum, I think he thought wasn't the best thing for you to have in kids, place. But he found out those little kids loved it, and he had it for them. But that was kind of a typical little story of when I would run into people. Everybody I ran into that knew him, that didn't know me, had a story about some way he touched them and something that he did. And I know when he passed, I was dreading the receiving line worse than anything because I thought it would be like rubbing salt in a wound. But all these people came through and shared these stories. And, it was just different things. But several of them told me independently that he was their Sunday school teacher when they were 11 years old or 9 years old or 12 years old or whatever. And that he's the one that led them to Christ. And how grateful they were to him for the way he brought God into it. But he was just, like I said, he wouldn't necessarily tell you unless you ask, I guess, if he was Christian in my times around him. But people seem to instinctively know. But the other thing that he did was he constantly invited people to go to church whenever he'd meet someone. He'd ask, if they were in church. And I think one of the most impactful things to me was when we were trying to put together his funeral. we were talking about something that somebody commented on something he had done, and the pastor chuckled and said, "Yeah, that's like the bus, isn't it?" And we said, "The bus?" And I'm thinking there was some story about a school bus, and he says, "Yeah, the bus for Crossroads Church." And he said, "Ron, you know about that?" And I said, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." And he turned to Eldon, and he said, "Eldon, to be sure, you know." And Eldon said, "No." And he turned to Mother. Mother said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He said, while he was, after he retired from the route, he went back to school, got his real estate license, and went as high in certification as you could go with real estate, and loved it. And his knowing so many people from the route was really a strong thing for him in real estate. His knowledge of the land, and who had what land, and also just that people knew him and trusted him. But as he went around, that showing real estate and things, and he'd get in the area where if he didn't see a church or something in that area, he would just stop at people's houses and ask if they went to church or where they went to church. And he found a lot of people didn't go to church. And he would say he had already helped start a mission that ended up in Lillington. It's where it's located now, Crossroads Church. And he said, he asked if they had children. This is the preacher telling me this. And he said, if they said they did, he'd say, "Would you let them go to church if a church bus would come by and pick them up and take them and bring them back?" And I guess enough said, "Sure, they want to do that, that'd be fine." But, these were people that didn't go to church. And so he said Dad came back to the church and said, "I need 5 people to agree to get their CDL license and run a bus route 1 week a month, one Sunday a month." And he said, and they said, "Well, we don't have a bus." And he said, "Well, if we can get 5 drivers, I believe there'll be a bus." And they got 5 drivers to agree, and they went out and got their CDL license. And Preacher Gruber said that once those 5 had their license, that a bus was in the church parking lot the next week. And none of us knew that he had done that.
I guess you don't know how he got the bus then.
No, I guess, he made pretty good money with this real estate.
Okay.
And I guess he just saved up the money and got it because, he saw that need. But see, we didn't even know it. The preacher is the only one that knew it. I'd have probably let that leak somewhere. If it had been me, I have to admit. That was a surprise to me. But he was, as you said, he was quiet.
Yeah, not attention seeking. So, if I'm remembering correctly, he was Presbyterian and at some point became Baptist. Are you aware of a time when that happened, or?
No, it was before my time. He was his mother was a McLean, and the land came through. It was a Scottish land grant. The farm that my parents have through several generations back in the McLean family, and so the Presbyterians were the dominant faith of the Scottish, as I understood it. And so I know Susan's dad was, Dr. Searles he was a Presbyterian as well.
So as far as you can remember, you guys always went to Antioch?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well,
and I think George W. Truett was Baptist.
Yeah.
So I think that might have been an influence there in his going over to that.
So briefly, because we're running out of time,
Okay.
I want us to touch on his basically. We know he was a rural mail carrier, but there was a point in time when it looked like he might be entering into World War II. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, he didn't become a rural mail carrier till he came out of World War II, and he had an insurance agency and was very successful at it. It was thriving. It was located in Sanford, which is where a lot of the Sloans lived. A lot of his father was from that area, Lee County. You still find a lot of Sloans in Lee County and up around Pittsburgh and Chapel Hill, more than anywhere else that I know of. But Dad was he was in the insurance business, and when World War II started, and he was, I guess, pulled into service, or I didn't know the story about how he went into service, but he sold his insurance agency to a Mr. McKeever in Sanford. And, of course, he had to sign a non-compete clause that he wouldn't come back and start another insurance agency. And so he sold it to Mr. McKeever. He went into the Army Air Corps and was in training at Douglas Field, I believe it was, in Charlotte or near Charlotte. And that's where he got licensed to fly. He finished flight school there. And not long after he finished flight school, the war ended, so he didn't have to go into combat. And
I remembered seeing some sort of thing in his office as a little kid that was like a cartoony drawing of somebody in a plane, and it was saying that he had been granted his wings or something as a pilot.
Mm-hmm.
So that must have been him finishing flight school.
Yeah, that was something they gave him at flight school, and said, I believe it said, darned if he didn't. On this date he, applied, or, took the test for this, in an attempt to pass it, and darned if he didn't. So he used to entertain me when I was a kid, telling stories of flying. He loved it. He just absolutely loved it. And he would get all excited. And I remember we went to see the movie Flubber, about Flubber, the what was it, Absent-Minded Professor? Mm-hmm. And he could put this flubber in his Model T and fly it around and everything. And I was sitting beside Dad in the theater, and Dad just was almost embarrassing to me, because he'd cried, he did an Emmerman, the flight maneuvers that they were doing. And he was laughing so loud, that I was like, Dad, but he went through flight school, got that. And then they, when the war ended, for the rest of his service, they put him in the mail service. One interesting little thing that happened, where he impacted things going forward, was the flight jackets that they had were like a sports coat sleeve, but they had a ribbed collar ring inside, not adhesive, but elastic ring, to keep air from going up the sleeve. And but it had, a cuff on it like a regular sports coat. And their controls were with a stick, and to do a maneuver, you had to, to roll, you had to do like this. Well, the stick was right between your legs, and their seat belts had a little flat plate with a lever, and you hit that to release the seat belt if you had to bail out of a plane. So they had it sticking up so it was easy to hit it. And while they were going through their flight training, you'd have the pilot trainer would be in the back and have the student in the front. No, it was the other way around. The student was in the back. And they'd go through these maneuvers, and there was double sticks, and the student in the back would take control to do it. But the pilot could take care of it if he needed to grab the stick. And they kept losing student pilots, not losing them, but they kept falling out of planes when they would do a rollover. And
do a barrel roll.
Yeah, they do a barrel roll, and when they did, the students would fall out, and they couldn't figure out why. And my dad figured out what was happening was the cuff on that jacket as they came from right to left was catching that buckle and flipping it. Wasn't getting the pilot, his stick was in a little different position. But so Dad said, why don't you put that elastic on the outside of the jacket cuff so it'll be tight, not have this, like trim that cuff off. And they did that. And from that point forward, the flight jackets came in and had the little ribbed cuff around them so that they couldn't snag on the seatbelt.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Could have been somebody else had the same idea at the same time. But
they made the first ones there to see if that would stop it. And it did.
Yeah.
I don't know if they wrapped the cuffs with something and it quit happening, or if they put the cuffs in the jackets or whatever. But he said they credited him by that. But anyway, that was just interesting.
So we're coming up on 38 minutes or so here, end of the podcast, and we're just now really getting into, we bounced around a little bit, but we haven't talked about him and Grandma's courtship. We haven't talked about him having kids. We haven't talked about your personal recollections of him. Don't think we're going to get all the way through all of that in one episode, so we'll have to do an Eldon part 2. Maybe that can be next week. Okay. So just remember where we left off. We'll pick right back up and go from there. To close out this week's episode, something that you have an entertainment recommendation, if it's a book or a movie or a TV show or music that you're listening to or anything, or just a fond memory from the past week, something that you'd like to share. Do you have anything dialed up for us?
Well, when you're saying recommending, book or a TV show or something, I have read all the books by Craig Johnson in his Longmire series, Longmire. Stories about a fictitious sheriff in a fictitious county in Wyoming. But they made it into a series on A&E and then moved to Netflix and finished it up. I think there were like 6 seasons of it. And it's one of the best Westerns I've ever seen. Everybody loves the character. He's humble and, a little flawed like we all are. He doesn't look like Mr. Super Cool. But he gets the job done and takes care of things, and he does the right thing. He kind of follows those principles that I grew up with heroes like the Lone Ranger and Roy Rogers. And like the Lone Ranger, his best friend is the Cheyenne Indian. And that's played by Lou Diamond Phillips. And it's just a great series, and you can find it now on. I think it's still running on Netflix, but I'm sure it's different places, and the books are out there. But that's something that I've watched the series 3 times all the way through all the seasons, and I'm at the age now I can watch them again for the first time.
Yeah. Well, mine is still playing Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, so that's still fun, and it's a long game, so I've got a lot going on there. But if I have to pick something new that I have recently gotten into or gotten back into, Another gift that Emily gave me for Christmas was the complete Sherlock Holmes in a nice volume from Barnes & Noble that's probably faux leather bound, but it's one of those, it looks nice. Yeah, and so...
Full stamped, I know.
Yeah, foil stamped all over it. So I cracked that open over the Christmas break and started reading A Study in Scarlet, and it just reminded me. Unfortunately, the very first Sherlock Holmes that I ever read back in high school or college was The Hound of the Baskervilles. And I say unfortunately because a lot of folks say that that's the best one. And I've read several. I think I've read A Study in Scarlet before, and I've read several of the Adventure of Sherlock Holmes and the little serial type stories. But just like you said with Longmire, I don't remember them, so I'm looking forward to going back and rereading them and experiencing them again. And already just the little bit that I've read, Arthur Conan Doyle was a very, very good writer in the sense that he just could put you in a scene in a way. I mean, the language back then, 19th century, it was so much more verbose. they had a higher vocabulary for describing things. I read in the introduction to that book how hard it was for Conan Doyle to do these stories and he tried to quit a few times over the course of his career because he had trouble coming up with the complex stories that would be satisfying and have a payoff to the audience. And I can imagine that that's true. Like after you do a few of these, you kind of, all right, what's the mystery going to be in this one? And he didn't have a team of writers like a television show had to help him come up with these different story ideas. But that would be my recommendation. For my current entertainment recommendation is something that started being written in 1888. Go check out The Complete Sherlock Holmes because it seems to be pretty good. So I think that's going to wrap things up for us this week. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll be back next week with Eldon Sloan Part 2 and updates on what's been going on. Actually, we may be recording that in just a few days, so there may not be that many updates to share with you, but we'll have something to share with you. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Good night.